Lisa studied the faces of the other children, hoping to see someone from her school, from her neighborhood, from her synagogue, yet the train was filled with strangers. There was a tag around each child's neck. Lisa was number 158. The train stopped several times in the night, and more children got on. The newcomers were packed into the aisles and sat wedged on top of their suitcases. There must be 50 of us on this car alone, thought Lisa. As the children prepared for another departure, there was a loud rapping against one of the windows. An older boy climbed up and lowered it to see what was happening. As the train lurched forward, a wicker laundry basket was thrust into the boy's arms. He put the basket in the aisle and moved away from it. Lisa had an odd feeling she could not explain, a certainty about something. She walked up the aisle, stood over the basket, and opened the lid. Before her lay a beautiful baby wrapped in a clean blanket and sound asleep. A little angel. She picked it up gently and cradled it. The older girls rushed to Lisa's side while the boys stood back. The car erupted in debate. What should we do with it? Does it have a tag? Do you think it's hungry? The baby started to cry and someone panicked. If they hear it, we'll all be thrown off. Lisa immediately began to hum Brahms' lullaby. The first melody she could think of. But the infant continued to cry. Lisa sang desperately to quiet the child, but to no avail. From up the aisle, a 16-year-old girl came and held out her arms. I have a little brother at home. Let me try. The girl took the child expertly and nestled her nose to its flesh. It smiled for a second. The entire car breathed a sigh of relief. When the infant's crying stopped, she eased him back to the basket and joined Lisa in scouring the car for juice, milk, and blankets. They took turns rocking and feeding the new baby. Lisa felt a growing sense of determination. If I can keep strong, she thought, I can make it. I'll make it for Mama, and I'll make it for Papa, and soon we will all be together again. A long, shrill whistle sounded, and the train stopped again. The children hid the juice in the blankets and pushed the basket under Lisa's seat. Someone saw a sign out the window. It's in Dutch! The sign's in Dutch! We must be at the border! A hush fell over them. A stony-faced SS officer made his way down the aisle for a final inspection. He checked names and numbers off a list on his clipboard. When the guards stopped at Lisa's row, all the children held their breath. Several began nervous conversations to cover the awkward silence that had fallen over the railroad car. The guard opened the lid of the basket and saw the sleeping baby. He stared at it for what seemed like an indeterminable moment, then looked at his list. Isn't he sweet? Lisa asked, interrupting him, and she smiled brilliantly, praying that it would distract him. She put every ounce of charm that she had into that smile. He turned and looked at her for a long moment, and finally, without uttering a word, moved on, making his way briskly down the aisle. He opened the heavy doors at the end of the car and disappeared into the next carriage. As the Kindertransport crossed the border into Holland, the lights inside the car came on for the first time, and cheers erupted. Lisa opened the basket and stared at the helpless bundle. No one can hurt you now, she whispered. It was a bright, moonlit night. Through the window, she saw the windmills turning slowly, like in a picture book Papa had shown her. They arrived at the Hook of Holland, the port on the North Sea. The train stopped, and an excited flock of round-cheeked Dutch women fluttered on board, carrying baskets filled with flat slices of fresh-baked bread and butter, and big, doughy shortcake biscuits. One lady balanced a tray of steaming mugs of cocoa. The children forgot their manners and charged forward, shouting, "Me! Me!" as they devoured the treats. The Dutch woman smiled at these faces smeared with chocolate. There was discussion amongst the women about the baby boy. A serious-looking man with red armband came up and introduced himself. He was from the Dutch Red Cross. A group of girls gathered around the baby and watched as he directed a Dutch woman to pick up the infant from the basket. She held it snugly to her chest. "We will find him a good home here," said the man. "How will his parents know where to find him?" Lisa asked. "I don't know." Lisa picked up the wicker hamper and handed it to him. "Please take the basket," she begged. "Maybe someday someone will recognize it. Please keep the basket with him." The man smiled sadly. Yes, of course. he said, and took both the baby and the basket with him. The children emerged shyly from the train compartment and were led through small stations and across the large, busy road to the seaport. When they realized there were no Nazi guards to keep them in line, some of the boys began to skip and play and trip the younger children around them. Lisa ignored all the scuffling and the silly boys and looked up at the loud cawing of the seagulls above her head. The smell of the sea air, the crisp and cool, raised her spirits. A bearded old seaman in a stiff green peacoat smiled and waved them along the dock toward the ramp. Hurry along and up. Next stop, England! Halfway up the ramp, Lisa stopped and looked back at the serene Dutch town with its orderly rows of thatched roofs. It didn't look the least bit like Vienna. Where will we end up, she wondered. Will there be an opera house? Will there be a tower like St. Stephen's? No time for such thoughts, she told herself, and she headed aboard. She was assigned the top bunk above a whiny 15-year-old who was seasick and proved it by vomiting into her pillow. Lisa lay awake for what seemed like hours. She looked out the tiny porthole next to the bunk, and the moon had disappeared, and it was impossible to tell anymore where the water ended and the sky began. Eventually, the steady rising and falling of the sea caught up with her, and she succumbed to a troubled sleep. She dreamed of her home in Franzenbergstrasse, and family was just sitting down to dinner. Mama was serving her brisket. Papa was at the head of the table, ready to carve. Sonia was there, noisy and impatient, and so was Rosie, stately and beautiful. The chair was empty. One chair was empty. "Where's Lisa?" her father asked from deep inside her sleep. Lisa tried to respond. "Here I am," she cried, but no one heard her. Waves of green water drowned out her voice. By morning, they reached the other side of the English Channel. It was gray and cloudy, and the single-file line of children walked down the gangplank. They clutched their little suitcases so tightly, one would have thought that they carried their hearts inside. A wiry man with a dark blue coat and a walrus mustache hurried them along. "There's a train to catch. Let's look lively. Hurry along, loves." The single-file line wound through the center of a tiny English village, looping around the quaint central square, and into the train station. It was dawn, and no one was up but the milkman. He stared at the eerie sight of more than 200 children winding through his town. Lisa thought they must have looked like a lost school field trip. She turned to stare at the vast sea that separated her from her family and all that she had ever known.